He was a pope like no other, humble, daring, and deeply human. Loved by millions across the globe and respected even by those outside his faith, Pope Francis didn't live like a ruler in robes. He lived like a servant in sneakers. But on April 20th, 2025, the world held its breath. Something was changing in Vatican City. The lights in the Apostolic Palace stayed dim, the bells stayed silent, and behind closed doors, history was taking its final breath. This is the complete story of the final 24 hours of Pope Francis, a man who rewrote the role of the modern pope, a man whose last day wasn't filled with gold or glory, but something far more powerful: humanity. Let's go hour by hour and uncover the legacy left behind in his last moments on earth. It began, as usual, at dawn, 5:45. Even though he was critically ill, Pope Francis refused to remain in bed. Weak from heart issues and persistent respiratory complications, he asked to be wheeled into the small private chapel inside the Apostolic Palace. The air was cool. A few candles flickered in the silence. He held his rosary and stared at the crucifix in deep thought. His longtime assistant, Father Gonzalo, said later, "He didn't look like a man preparing to die. He looked like someone preparing to go home." For 45 minutes he prayed. No aides, no cameras, no public, only the Pope and his God. Some said they saw tears in his eyes, but he never spoke. He simply whispered the rosary, his lips trembling, his hands shaking slightly, still gripping the cross like a lifeline. At 7 p.m. he requested a private mass. A handful of trusted clergy gathered quietly, knowing this would likely be his last. He insisted on participating despite his deteriorating strength. It was hard for him to speak, and he often paused to catch his breath. But he managed to deliver a small homily. He said, "When I was a child in Buenos Aires, I asked a priest if God can cry. He told me no. But I don't believe that. I think God cries every time we forget how to love." He looked into the eyes of each person in the room, offering them a final blessing. Some whispered, some silent. For many, it felt more like a goodbye than a service. As he raised the Eucharist, he winced slightly in pain, but he did it, one last time, at 9 a.m. Despite doctor's advice, he asked for his audio recorder. Alone in his study, Pope Francis recorded what would become his last public message. He spoke for 7 minutes. He condemned war and division. He called for global unity. He asked world leaders to choose bridges, not bombs. He warned about digital manipulation and the spiritual cost of living through screens. And then he paused and spoke in English. "The future will not be built with firewalls or fear. It will be built with hands, yours and mine. Build bridges. Please, build bridges." Those were his final words to the public. The audio was released after his death. The world listened in stunned silence. CNN called it the most moving farewell since Martin Luther King's last speech. At 10:02 a.m. After recording, he spent time looking through old letters. One in particular stayed in his lap, a wrinkled, yellowed letter from his grandmother, Rosa. It was the note she gave him before he joined the seminary as a young man. It read, "Be kind, be poor, be brave, and never forget where you came from." Throughout his papacy, those words echoed in his actions. He rejected luxury apartments for a modest guest house. He drove a Ford Focus instead of a limousine. He spent more time with the homeless than with kings. He didn't rule the church. He served it. At 12 p.m. by noon, whispers had spread across the Vatican. The Pope's condition was declining rapidly. One by one, key cardinals were allowed into the room. Each had a few minutes. Some bowed, some wept. Some stood frozen, unable to speak. A cardinal from Brazil said later, "He didn't speak like a pope. He spoke like a father, saying goodbye to his children." There was no ceremony, no photographs, just personal, whispered farewells. He reminded one, "Stay with the poor." To another, "Don't protect the institution, protect the people." It wasn't an audience. It was a passing of the torch at 2 p.m. Doctors encouraged him to rest, to take more medicine, but Pope Francis declined. He said simply, "Let me go to the Father in peace." He remained in his wheelchair, eyes closed, fingers tracing the crucifix. At this point, he barely spoke. He drank only a little water. His blood pressure had dropped significantly, but he remained alert. The Vatican's emergency medical team stood by, but he insisted there be no resuscitation. He signed a final directive. No machines, no intervention, only prayer. At 4 p.m. he spent his final hours writing by hand, notes, names, blessings, pages filled with simple messages. To the youth, dream louder. To the migrants, you are not forgotten. To the clergy, serve with your sleeves rolled up. He also left specific instructions for his burial. No gold, no cathedral, just a wooden cross and a shared grave with the poor. His wishes shocked many traditionalists, but not those who truly knew him. At 6:30 p.m., he asked to be taken to the window of the Apostolic Palace. There were no crowds in the square below, only the Roman sunset melting into orange and gold. He made the sign of the cross, then placed his hand against the glass. Witnesses say he closed his eyes and smiled faintly. It was the last time he saw the world. At 8 p.m. The Pope was now in a reclined chair, barely conscious. 4 of his closest priests stayed beside him, quietly reciting psalms. Soft music played from a nearby speaker, a simple recording of an Argentinian folk hymn he loved. His breathing was labored, but his hands were still folded in prayer. At 10 p.m., he opened his eyes briefly and said something almost inaudible. One priest leaned in and heard, "Love is stronger." It would be his final message. At 2:17 a.m., Pope Francis took his last breath. There were no trumpets. No crowds, only stillness, candlelight, and a single crucifix beside him. How the world reacts to his death. By sunrise, the Vatican released a statement. His Holiness, Pope Francis, has returned to the house of the Father. The world responded instantly. Churches rang their bells. Flags were lowered. In Argentina, tens of thousands flooded the streets to mourn their native son. In New York, Times Square lit up with the message, "Thank you, Francis." In Paris, atheists and Catholics alike wept in candlelight. Even leaders with little connection to the Catholic Church paid tribute. The UN Secretary General called him a moral giant. President Biden said, "The world just lost its greatest voice of conscience." And Elon Musk tweeted, "He wasn't just a pope, he was the soul of the earth." What made Pope Francis different? He was more than a religious leader. He was a moral rebel, a challenger of comfort, a fighter for justice. He visited slums before, summits, washed the feet of prisoners, ate lunch with the homeless instead of dining with royalty. He criticized billionaires, dictators, and corrupt clergy alike. He called climate change the cry of the earth. He spoke boldly on topics the Church had avoided for centuries. He didn't build walls, he broke them. He redefined what it meant to be holy, not distant or divine, but present and human. In one of his last interviews, Pope Francis was asked how he wished to be remembered. He smiled and said, "As someone who didn't look away." That was him. A man who looked pain in the face, who looked injustice in the eye, who looked at the world and still believed in love. There will be many more popes, but there will never be another Francis. He didn't want statues, he wanted service. He didn't seek praise, he offered peace. And in his last 24 hours, he gave us one final sermon, without a pulpit, without a mic. Just silence, sacrifice, and soul. Thank you, Pope Francis. You reminded us that kindness is strength, humility is power, and that the loudest prayers are often whispered. Rest in peace. What do you think? Pope Francis's final moments were deeply moving and filled with profound messages of love, humility, and peace. What did his last 24 hours mean to you? Do you have any thoughts or reflections you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Share and subscribe. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends and family to keep the memory of Pope Francis's legacy alive. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful content like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video.